Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Love with Megan podcast, talking all things holistic health and mind, body, soul, healing and expansion with me, your host, Megan Cooper. In this episode, we have the amazing Soph Trew. I don't know anyone that knows more about health and healing than Soph, the absolute fountain of knowledge and wisdom. 8 years ago, age 23, Soph was diagnosed with blood cancer. After 6 months of chemo, she started integrating lots of mind-body tools. And what began as her own healing path has expanded into her work now, supporting others to connect to their own self-healing abilities and to come back to their own bodies and empower themselves in their own health. Soph has trained all over the world in so many different modalities, understanding the mind, the body, the mind-body connection, the nervous system and the breath. We'll be focusing today on her work as a breathwork facilitator and her training as a death doula. I am immensely fascinated and inspired by Soph's work with end-of-life care and the conversations that brings up around death. Conversations around death are rather missing in our society, which makes it seem quite taboo and generates a lot of fear around something that is inevitable. Soph's early dance with her own mortality with her diagnosis of blood cancer, age 23, has created such an incredible and profound platform for her to facilitate and hold space for these powerful conversations and hold people in the process of both life and death. In this episode, we'll be discussing how to live better, breathe better, and die better, and how really they are all part of the same, the rich tapestry of the human experience. All right, my love. Well, I'm really excited to have you here, finally. I know that we've been planning this podcast for about 6 months, so it's very exciting to have you actually finally here. So welcoming in Soph.
It's a joy to be here. Thank you.
Why don't we just kick off by you introducing yourself, kind of your journey that you've had so far. And I know that it's been an absolutely incredible, wild, wonderful and challenging and everything in between experience over the last kind of 10 years, leading you to an incredible line of work with breath and also going into death work, which I can't wait to speak to you about. So if you could give us an introduction into your background, that would be awesome.
So everything kind of began for me in the sense of what I'm up to and the path I'm now on. About 8 years ago, when I just graduated from university, was wanting to go into documentary. I was on a quest to become Louis Theroux's assistant or sidekick, and was making a documentary out in Colombia, and came back from there and started to get some symptoms. Things like night sweats, was feeling really tired, but I kind of put it down to lots of traveling and moving around and everything that was happening. And at that point, I was diagnosed with a blood cancer. So I was diagnosed with lymphoma, and age 23, had no idea about health, didn't know anything about the mind-body connection or nutrition or gut health or how all of these factors may connect to how we are, and started to, so I had 6 months of chemo, went down lots of brutal treatment paths, but then started integrating different tools along the way to recover and get to vitality. And fast forward to now, what began as my own personal healing path has then evolved into supporting others to also connect to their self-healing abilities, to come back into their bodies and to know that there are more options out there and to really empower themselves. So have trained with different teachers, had the privilege to train in different countries around the world. But the thing that really landed for me was when I discovered breathwork. So before I was diagnosed, I was an asthmatic, and asthmatics usually are upper chest breathers. And no one had ever asked me, how are you breathing? And after chemotherapy, had quite a lot of disassociation, those kind of trauma symptoms from ongoing hospital trips and visits. And the thing that really brought me back home was discovering the power of my breath and that simple tool for coming into the present moment, releasing trauma, releasing tension, but also feeling more inspired and alive and creative. And then beyond that, I guess the death work part is that along the way, connecting to lots of different friends in the cancer community, but in other communities who are living with life-limiting conditions, but then quite a few friends who have now died in their 20s and their 30s, almost felt like there's this elephant in the room and no one wants to talk about death. And culturally, we're kind of a grief-illiterate culture where we have this block around talking about death and endings. It's like we're always kind of holding on, or I don't want it to end, even the weekend. And yeah, people often say death work, you don't choose death work, it's kind of, it happens to you. And yeah, this has kind of come more into my line after seeing so many friends isolated at those final stages and not having the conversations and not really knowing their options as well and what's available to them. So yeah, it's a great, I get invited to lots of parties, Megan, talking about death, talking about...
You'd get invited to my party.
Yeah. Actually, my teacher, so when I did my death doula training, which essentially a little bit like a birth doula, you have a birth midwife, you have death doulas who support you holistically with end of life care. That might be emotionally, spiritually, physically. My teacher always says, talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about death won't make you die. So that's the kind of sentiment. So yeah, the personal kind of cancer experience has led into this amazing exploration into the fascinating world of everything that we're part of. And it's ongoing. It's kind of this constant discoveries and learnings, and I love what I do. I love the breath work. I love exploring death and dying, and the other side of kind of psychedelics, the end of life, which you might touch on as well.
Amazing. Wow. And you have so much wisdom. Obviously, being diagnosed with cancer aged 23, that's big. I mean, when I was 23, I was just quite an irresponsible human. That must have been huge. What was it like being faced with your own mortality at such a young age? What is that like? Because certainly when I was 23, you don't think about death. You're there and you have this huge long life ahead of you, and then suddenly, I guess, when you're faced with something like that, how does that impact your life?
It's an interesting one, because I'd say, as I said, kind of growing up in this culture where, for me at least, there's this almost kind of, I remember we were driving to a funeral I think it was about a year ago, and I said to Mum, so what would you want to happen if you did die? And she said, what? Not if you did die, when you die. And she said, well, if I die, I would kind of choose these options. And there's almost been this thing of if it happens, but it's the only certainty. It's that one event we know for all of us collectively that's going to happen. And so those preparations, but I grew up in kind of like a death phobic household. And I would say society, generally, we have that. And so I had this fear of it because it was the great unknown. And then confronted with it at age 23, and I'd kind of be on the ward, and you'd make friends with people when you're having treatment. And I remember the first friend that I met, and the nurse, I remember asking one week, so where's she gone? And the nurse was like, oh, Joe's no longer with us. And so it was kind of this instant, that was when it kind of dropped, the realization of, wow, okay, I was kind of forced, or maybe I had to change my relationship to what it meant with death. And yeah, it was a powerful time. Also, you say I was also an irresponsible young adult kind of in my party days, but it's kind of this step-by-step process. And for me, now that some of my favorite people have died, it almost makes it less scary. It's kind of this knowing of, actually, just this kind of sense of so much more. I don't think I'd ever sat with, again, I'd never discovered I don't think I'd ever really had much conscious awareness or thought at that stage, like we all do in our early 20s. And so I'd never explored what my relationship was to death. And then beyond that, I started to do that. And actually it brought a sense of ease going on that process and leaning into that unknown step by step.
And it's fascinating now that your work revolves around breath, which is essentially life-giving, and then around end-of-life care, which is obviously supporting people at the end. So it's kind of holding this profound encapsulation of the human experience. It's like both life and death at the same time, right? But, they're inevitable parts of why we're here and what we're all going to experience. So what was it that led you to breath? And I know that you've done so many different trainings and, been all around the world studying with different teachers and things. What was it that drew you to breath work?
And as you say, with that kind of life path, it's the first and last thing we do, isn't it?
Yeah.
And those breaths in between really matter. And the inhale represents taking in life, and the exhale is like that ending. So I love the kind of little ritual that you can have around that. And it can be a really grounding presence for us. So breath work, I used to run a festival, and it was called True Fields, and it was a cancer awareness and holistic health festival, which again, people are like, festivals are supposed to be about celebration, but it really was. It was about celebrating life, exploring the different things that we could do to really thrive beyond a diagnosis, to learn about prevention and health, but also come together as a community to enjoy music and different activities. So I had that, and I had my breathwork teacher actually came to that, and she was running breathwork workshops. And at that point, I don't think it's the funny thing that the teacher appears when we're ready. And when I first did the festival, didn't really try it, but a couple of years later, ended up going to train. I saw that she was running a training in India and got drawn to go and do that. And it was such an interesting one because I'd done a lot of mind training. So I'd done a lot of the mindset work, the coaching, living in my head rather than in my body. And that's actually really what cancer taught me as well, that I had a body that needed care and that existed, and to really slow down and check in. But with the breath, when it came to breath work, I think I had a bit of a vulnerability, resistance as well. And so it's easier to talk ourselves out of it. But when it comes to the breath, there's no talking, and you're just dropping into what is there in the soma, in the body. And after kind of moving through the resistance, I remember the first day of the training, I said, I don't want to do this. I don't want to breathe. And then kind of going there, it was the first time that I had all of these realizations of, so it's that kind of thing of our biology is our biography, and everything is held in the physical. And I had these feelings that I'd never had before, the releasing, the shaking, almost like releasing this kind of survival fear in my root chakra. So our root, which is connected to survival, I could shake from there for about a week when I was doing the training. And these different things happen. And often people are really surprised by how quickly they get sensations and experiences. And for me, I really feel like everyone has their unique tool, their thing that's going to get them back to vitality, or different things we all do and the different things that bring us joy. But that simplicity of connecting to my breath and doing that was just powerful. And I just remember thinking, wow, it felt like a homecoming when I was doing the breathwork training. It was like, okay, this is where I need to be. And beyond that, I healed from asthma. So I was asthmatic from the age of 8, no more after doing that. And yeah, lots of things started to shift. So I think it became the tool that I really, from personal experience, really resonated with. But when it comes to cancer as well and different illnesses, the way we breathe affects every system and function in our body. So it affects our digestive system, it affects our heart. And it's the only thing that we do without thinking, but that we can also do consciously, that can affect all of those functionings. And also our immune system takes us into an expanded state of thinking as well, similar to meditation. But often people who say that they can't meditate find breathwork really supportive because they get quite instant results or benefits from it. And so, yeah, it was just a really powerful tool and something we can all do and free as well.
Wow. Yeah. I'm fascinated by breathwork, and I know that it's becoming a lot more, what can we say, widespread. I mean, the fact that Wim Hof just did a documentary on the BBC that my mother watched. My mum phones me up being like, wow, I think breathwork's really powerful. I was like, Mum, I've been talking about it for 5 years and now it's on the BBC. You're taking notice.
He absolutely rocked it.
Yeah. But I mean, you're right. Like, we just don't know how much it affects in the body. And I mean, it should be kind of obvious when you think about it. Like, of course, we're bringing oxygen into the body and it's fueling every single cell. I used to have digestive issues. And I remember speaking to somebody on one of my yoga teacher trainings, one of the teachers, and he was like, oh, it's because you don't breathe properly. I was like, oh, right. Okay. He was like, if you start breathing properly, it will go away. I was like, oh, right. Great. Nice and easy then. And with the immune system, Wim Hof, the fact that he injected himself with like, what was it, like E. coli or something, and he didn't get sick because he controlled his breathing. I mean, that's insane.
But 25, most people in the world are only, so every day we take on average 20,000 breaths. Most people are only using about 25% of their lung capacity. And so that then has the knock-on effect of, so I think we so many people I speak to at the moment are anxious. It's almost like this chicken and egg thing with anxiety. So if you don't breathe into your belly, think about when you're anxious, what happens to your breath. For every feeling, for every emotion, there's a different breathing pattern. So when we're stressed, we breathe a certain way. When we're in grief, we're going to be breathing. We might hold our breath. It's almost like this. And so the chicken and egg with anxiety, for example, is that when we don't breathe into our bellies, the blood vessels in our bellies send a signal to our brain that they're not getting oxygen, and that actually triggers anxiety. So it's kind of like this cycle. And a lot of people struggle to do the belly breath. But what we often say is, if you think about the last time you held a baby or saw a dog, or if you've got a cat, they don't only breathe in their upper chest and they don't only breathe in their belly. They have this really fluid upper chest and belly motion. As we get older from in our childhood, the first thing we change when we experience fear or stress is our breath. So people start to edit themselves through the way that they breathe. And in order to not feel something, we'll hold our breath. So 80% of people hold their breath when they read their emails.
Wow. I actually, that's so funny that you say that, because I remember when I in my past life as an insurance broker, my boss would always joke, because the printer was next to my desk, and then whenever he needed to come and pick something up, he'd be like, Megan, you're doing it again. And I'd be sitting there with a massive frown on my face, because I have like a resting bitch face when looking at my computer, and I'd hold my breath. And then every time he'd come to the computer, I'd like gasp, because I hadn't breathed for about a minute or like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And so it's funny that you say that. So yeah, I can imagine that.
When we're concentrating, we do it. Yeah, concentrating, we're focused, but it's often that thing as well of, a lot of us can struggle to let go. And again, that connects to dying, that letting go process of the things that we love and the people that we love and all of those things. But your exhale represents letting go. And so often I see people, and I've got some people close to me like this, who can't let go. And they do this. They take a deep breath in and they hold it. And it's almost like this thing of, we just hold it in our bodies. And so it's a really good practice of, how do I let go? Relaxing your jaw, relaxing your shoulders. Yeah, we can tell everything about. And if we want to change how we feel, changing the way that we breathe will really connect to that.
Yeah, beautiful. And there's one of my meditation teachers talks about, the difference between doing and being in the world. But he talks about, how the world itself has been in this kind of hustle doing energy for such a long time. And he calls it the great inhale, as in we've been pouring in, like breathing in and holding it in. And now what the world really needs, if we look at the climate, if we look at, everything that the world needs to experience in order to heal, he talks about it needing to be this big exhale, where actually humanity, society, the world just takes this big exhale and we just let go. And we come back into our parasympathetic nervous system, back into our reset. So yeah, it just reminds me of it reminded me of that, what you're talking about, just needing this big exhale, just this big letting go.
And that's a really key one. How do I exhale? How do I let go? Yeah. Because it's almost like, again, something a little bit can die off on the exhale, and a little bit can be born on the inhale. But we have that kind of productivity focus, don't we? And in order to really heal, we need to regulate our nervous system. And so many people want to do all the doings, or we kind of are led to thinking, I'll do the nutrition, I speak to people and they'll say, so I'm doing this, I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this. And I'm like, how's the kind of being process in that? Or is there any space to do nothing? And often we think, okay, I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to take this book and I'm going to send all my messages and do all of these things. And there's such a focus on activity. And if something's always on, like a computer, we just know the effects longer term on our systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And for women, we're in this constant, society wants us to be in this constant doing, but actually if we look at our innate menstrual cycle, we have an inbuilt reset button where we're kind of, our body wants us to go into this being energy. And I only learned that when I had severe hormonal dysregulation, and then suddenly started to look at how my body should be responding throughout different phases of my cycle. And I was like, oh, wow, we are actually not supposed to be on all the time as humans. It's just that we've kind of we've set ourselves to be that way. So yeah, the big exhale. So learning to breathe and learning to breathe correctly, from what you've said, it's so important for every single aspect of our health, whether it's physical health, our mental health, and our emotional health. But also, I'm really interested in this other aspect of breath work, which is trauma release breath work. I in Bali did my first breathwork class and I didn't know what to expect, and kind of went along with a friend, and she was like, it could be a bit intense. I had no idea what was coming. And it was like transformational breathwork, and I was shaking, I was crying, technique hands. Yeah, it was a huge experience. Can you explain how that works, how trauma is actually stored in the body, and how that creates dis-ease or disease, and then how breath work comes to release that?
Yeah, it's a huge one. It makes me laugh when you say your friend said it could be intense. I think a lot of people have had a similar situation when it comes to the breath. So my first workshop I went to, and someone was hysterically laughing, someone's crying, someone's having an orgasm, all of these different things are happening. I remember being so startled by it. But on the trauma piece, so really the trauma element is too much too soon. So something happened, people talk about big T traumas, little T traumas. Something happened to our system that was too much too soon. And then that tension, that experience can get locked in our body. And what can happen when we start to breathe deep is we start to clear some of that tension, some of that tightness. So we might start to feel those releases. People might go back into visions, or they might get some flashbacks, or they might get some experiences, but it's almost like a big let go for the body. And so it's good to work with kind of a titration method, which is what someone like Peter Levine would talk about, where we go to the edge, but we don't go over the edge. So we want to gently start to release some of that, and then come back to safety, and then go, and then come back. So yeah, it's a really powerful tool for that. And then guided with integration is really key as well.
No, it's fascinating, isn't it? And you mentioned this early on when you were talking about your cancer diagnosis, that we live up in our heads and we forget that we have this body. And when trauma happens to us, whether it's big T trauma, little T trauma, and just things that happen to us on a daily basis, we can kind of mentally process things, but we forget actually that it has this impact, that it's stored somewhere. Do you see a lot of sickness and ailments and dis-ease as connected strongly to our emotions?
Totally. I feel like that tension that we have in our heads then manifests in our bodies, and anything that we're not able to process at that time, again, too much too soon, or the overwhelm, gets stored in our bodies. Our nervous systems haven't evolved beyond the time that we were in the wild, and we were maybe chased by a wild animal. Our lives have transformed beyond recognition beyond that time, but we have those primal wild innate instincts, and we haven't adapted. Well, naturally we're still in that phase. And so again, like the holding your breath when you're opening your emails, that can feel like a threat. So we're kind of constantly under threat, and having the tools, having those balancing tools, taking deep breaths, knowing how to release, relax, unwind can be really powerful. Even a lot of people are talking about cold water therapy. That can be a great way for us to come into the present moment and to release some of that in our nervous system as well.
Yeah, amazing, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of cold water. Lots of cold water swimming here in Brighton.
Oh yeah. As you said, do you see that the mind-body connection is the key kind of thing when it comes to health? So much so, because every organ has a different emotional root and different connection. So our lungs, for people when they come to the breath, often they might feel that they're quite emotional or they might cry. And some people have a really good laugh. And our lungs hold joy, they hold grief. So there's that connection. Our liver holds anger. So we've been in liver season around springtime, but these things can show up in the physical, that kind of those emotions that we might hold in. So often when someone dies as well, people close to them might get a cough, they might get a little bit of a lung infection. There might be something that happens, and it's the lungs, that element as well. So really, when we can start to release the tension in our minds, we can release it in our bodies.
Beautiful. So moving on a little bit from the life-sustaining breath to the murkier waters of death, can you speak to us a little bit about how you got into doing your death doula training, what exactly that means?
Interestingly, actually, I'm born on Day of the Dead, 2nd of November. Whenever I've done a reading, a Mayan reading, I was living in Mexico and they did a reading and they always said you're going to have this kind of connection to death. And at some point you might have an early experience in your life with death. And as I said, it's this kind of thing that you don't decide to go into death work, but it's been this process of realizing how isolated a lot of people are at end of life, mainly from being around younger friends in their 20s, 30s who have died from cancer. And just realizing the huge gaps in care that are there, but also that no one's really talking about the things that can be supportive. And similar, we have such a focus on birth and planning our birth. And it's the same as someone choosing to have a birth doula, so someone to guide them through the process of birth, emotionally, spiritually, physically, with those elements. It's like a guide to support you alongside. So a death doula supporting you alongside the dying process. And that can be before we're in the dying process. That can be just you and I right now preparing, making some preparations. And for me, in that stage, it's this thing of let's talk about death so we can get on with living. Because so many of the times people think, oh, death, this kind of element. But for me, having them work through my fear of death, it's actually it's kind of brought more life in this funny sense. It's almost like where there's death, there's so much life, because there's so much truth and authenticity and everything that kind of may come about when we know that the end is near or finite. So it kind of unfolded. I was exploring who I might train with and who I might want to become a death doula with, and saw a really brilliant TED talk with a woman called Alua Arthur, who runs Going with Grace, and she does death doula training. And I just instantly, and it's a full body yes, I just instantly knew I had to do this training with her. So started doing that a couple of years ago, and yeah, it's just been, I'm going to start volunteering in the hospice, and it's such important work. And there are ways that we can do death differently, and there are ways that we can talk about it and empower ourselves and just know a little bit more. Obviously it's that hard, there's so much pain around it, but I think there's a lot of conversations that we can be having to open things up a little bit. And other cultures, for example, I've got an app on my phone. A lot of people may not be into it, but it says don't forget you're going to die. So I get daily reminders that remind me that I'm going to die. And I think it came from Bhutan, that they meditate every day on impermanence and on death. And if we can kind of look at ourselves and say, I'm going to die, and then we start to kind of make these choices in a different way day to day on how we live with that awareness. I often it's something, a practice that I need to tap back into. But often I think, if this was my last experience or conversation with someone, how would I want to treat them? How would I want the interaction to be? And so I think on a personal level, the deaf doula training, so yeah, it's like a midwife at the end of life. And that Ram Dass quote, we're all walking each other home. So it's supporting someone in that kind of walking home process, supporting loved ones, supporting their support system. It can be, it's not just the dying person, but the whole system around them. And we can work alongside hospice, we work alongside the hospitals, with a range of different things. It might be practical, it might be legal stuff, it might be exploring getting your affairs in order. There's this thing of, who knows your passwords? Where's all of your important documents kept? All of these elements. And that I have definitely not done either. The organization around it. But it really can help people to have more quality time as well. The role of having a doula involved. Yeah, it's fascinating. And yeah, a real privilege as well. Again, people talk about it kind of as standing at the doorway of existence. At kind of birth, you're standing at the doorway of existence when a baby is born, and then when someone dies, it's this other portal.
I'm fascinated by how other cultures receive death. You know, like, I mean, can you give the example of Mexico? Like, generally, how does that culture view death? How is it different to ours?
So grief and the process of grieving, but also the process of dying, is very much in community. I feel like here maybe we have quite an isolated approach to grief and death. It's very sanitized over there. So they've got Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, and that's on the 2nd of November. And every year it is an event where families and loved ones will cook the meal of their deceased relatives, and they'll put out their favorite drink. And they kind of do this to honor and celebrate them. And everyone comes together for this. So it's almost like kind of collective sharing in that. Grief is much more visible. They'll kind of walk out on the streets, and there'll be processions in the streets for the dying person. There's more rituals around it. In other cultures as well, there's a lot around that. So in India, even in Ireland, people talk about kind of waking the dead. They sing, they wail together. Whereas in England in particular, it's kind of like this hidden thing. We have such a closed, often in a lot of places, kind of closed, isolated experience with it. And I think there's a lot to be said about bringing back. I feel like we're kind of ritual starved, we're kind of ceremony starved. And yeah, a lot to be said about bringing back those rituals and rites of passage in life. For example, when we maybe, for something new to happen, something has to die, right? So if we're getting married, it's the death of the single person. Or if we're having a child, it's the death of being childless, or whatever it is. It's all of these little deaths that we go through in life, not just the kind of the final one. But we don't tend to mark those occasions as much. And so it's kind of bringing back more of those rituals could be a really beautiful thing.
Yeah. Why is it that you think that we've lost our connection to it so much?
I think a lot of people might trace it back to, there's the kind of history of death. And in Victorian times, if you were grieving, you'd wear a black band on your arm and you'd show that you were grieving, and that would go on for a few years. And people would kind of give you that respect or that acknowledgement. When the war happened, I feel like there was so much grief that we almost, that was our kind of numbing period. It's kind of like life needs to continue. And it kind of changed our relationship with it. Even the funeral industry, a lot of people aren't aware of their rights at the end of life. And you don't actually have to have a funeral. You don't have to have random people bringing you in that you don't. This kind of, the funeral industry is such a, for me, yeah, it's people knowing that they can do that differently as well. I think maybe too much grief. Again, maybe there was trauma around the wars that happened that was too much too soon, and we just kind of wanted to continue life. And also in the culture that we live in, with everything, as we said, kind of connected to productivity and work, grief, there's not really much space for grief because it's not productive and it's not making money.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because anything that doesn't get talked about creates shame and fear. You know, it's the same with sex. It's the same with a woman's menstrual cycle. You know, anything that is not, in inverted commas, kind of polite society type talk, we create all of these ideas around what it's actually like. And it's, you know, we remove that kind of humanness from it, and it gets this huge stigma attached.
Totally. And because death has become so sanitized, so often people don't, we've kind of lost that thing of dying at home. And inevitably we all kind of have a way that we may like that to happen. Maybe we'd be at home. But a lot of people are dying in hospitals in different situations. And so we've kind of lost that connection to what is it like to care for a loved one at home and those instincts. Whereas previously that would be around us and we'd have more awareness, but now it's kind of sanitized. And as you said, it becomes this great unknown because it is just the huge mystery of life, isn't it? What happens? Where do we go? If we go anywhere? Yeah.
Like, why do you feel we're so scared of it? And, you know, talking about it and thinking about it. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, I mean, you mentioned obviously the attitude towards it in Bhutan, but within Buddhism, you know, impermanence is a huge teaching within Buddhism. And if we can let go of this idea of our own permanence, of us being here, it allows us to love more fully, to live more fully. So why do you feel like this fear is there so much?
I think we have quite a afraid society anyway, don't we? There's a lot of elements, but also that education. There's really not much education around death. It's not really spoken about in families. A lot of people have the FOMOs. They're afraid of what am I going to leave behind or what will happen when I'm gone. The fear around kind of pain. We don't like discomfort. So there's the fear around how it's going to happen, which of course we all have inevitably. But there just hasn't been kind of preparation as well. And when something is so unknown, as you say, it does become that kind of cloud, that elephant in the room. And whenever I say to people, I've said to friends, so training in death doula work, and a lot are really receptive to it, and others go, oh God, I don't want to talk about that. It's almost like, as I said, talking about death will make it happen. So we kind of think we're bringing it on. Whereas for me, actually, there's so much power that we can have in talking about that. And there's so much awareness. It can really, knowing that we are going to die, can transform the way that we live and transform our relationships. We might heal the relationships. So many people wait until they're dying to go. And this is often the number one thing that people talk about coming up is, hold on, I can't die because actually I haven't done all of these things that I planned to do when I knew that I was living. And so we wait. This kind of dress rehearsal element. We wait to, I don't know, start the relationship. We wait to start the job. We wait to do all of these things because it's kind of postponed. And then when we know that we may have less time than we imagined, people sometimes say, in the last year of my life, I lived more than I ever did, if they're able to do that. And that might be things like healing their relationships, because we can wait until the deathbed to think, oh, actually, I should have said that thing to that person. There's so much in it. It's huge.
I find it fascinating because I think about death a lot. And I mean, I've never been faced very, you know, I've had the privilege of never been, well, maybe that's not a privilege. Maybe it's more of a privilege when you have been faced with your own mortality. But I've, you know, I think about it, I conceptualize it, but from a place of like, when I wake up in the morning, I'm like, wow, some people didn't wake up this morning. I get a day. And if I was going to be one of those people that didn't wake up, I would, you know, what would I do today if I knew that I only have one day? Or, you know, like one of my best friends, Betty, her mum passed away very, very suddenly last year. And over the last year, we've had so many conversations about death, you know, going for a swim in the morning and then sitting on the beach and having coffee and talking about death. And I find it so expansive just talking about this stuff and being able to air it, you know. And if we can live our lives from a place of knowing that it's real, that, you know, like you said, like living more fully, living more in the moment and seeing it all as a gift, then yeah, it's just, it can be so expansive.
Totally. And I think it depends on what our relationship to it is, because as part of the death doula work, it's this funny thing. Again, the way that we project as humans. We may be with someone who's dying and we have our version of how we think a good death. People talk about a good death, whatever that means. We have a version of how we might like to do it. And actually, everyone has their own unique ways. And it's really personalizing this. What would someone want at their bedside? Connecting to those kind of senses, what smells, what sounds, what sights. And again, there's the difference, as you said, with Betty, and you were speaking about the sudden death. A lot of the majority of the work that we would do as death doulas is those who know that they are in the dying process. So it would be from chronic disease, because the other side, we can't really kind of talk about those preparations. Yeah, it's that thing of the way that I think dying would be very different to the way that you would want it. And so as a death doula, we have to work through our own beliefs and our own fears and really explore those. But it's this thing of how can we live a life that we can die from? And for me, that awareness, I think it's been one of the most enriching things, knowing that I'm going to die from a young age, because it does just open you up to really living as well. I just think, actually, screw it, I'll do this. I'll kind of explore working in this way, being in this way. Just it definitely has been a privilege of maybe a bit of an expansion in that sense. But I wonder what it would take for you to start thinking about that more. And maybe it's because you have a wider belief. Maybe there's something that you feel more comfortable with, or maybe you've been in spaces where death was acknowledged.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I didn't grow up really with conversations around death or surrounded by death, but I would say that having a spiritual belief definitely, I would say, expands that for me. And perhaps that's an interesting point. You know, in your experience of facing your own mortality and being surrounded by death and obviously doing your death doula training, would you say that there are specific things or themes or commonalities between people who are more accepting or open to conversations around death, things that make it easier for people to pass over, people who are, let's say, less afraid of death? Is there a similar quality or an attitude that they share?
I've noticed that those who have developed their own relationship with death over their life or towards the end of their life can tend to have more of, whether we call it an easier experience when it comes to the end, or just more acceptance and more ease of letting go and that whole process. I think those who have a spiritual practice and have developed a spiritual practice throughout their life certainly have a different relationship with death. And those who believe that they're more than their body and that their soul continues, for example, or an energy continues beyond them that is greater than this physical form, definitely have more ease with that end process. And maybe they don't see it as an end, but a continuum and an ongoing element of their soul journey. So those who have a meditation practice, who have had an out-of-body experience or a transcendental experience, perhaps those who have had a psychedelic experience where they might have experienced ego death. And also it really depends on the support system you have around you. From what I've seen, those who can support you in that surrender, where the families kind of are there to support you in letting go, maybe giving permission. It's safe for you to go now, that kind of nurturing process towards the end. There are a number of factors to this, and it's a really interesting question. So definitely the spiritual aspects, those who maybe have a religious belief, have a faith, have had experiences with being close to death and kind of develop their own relationship with it, whether or not they do believe in an afterlife. Those who maybe have just spent time reflecting on what death means to them, and that question, what is death to me? What would I like to happen to me in the final stages? And all of these aspects can really transform that period in the way that we do die.
So fascinating, my love. Thank you.
I just love the link here between getting used to letting go throughout our life, you know, starting with the breath, you know, just being more comfortable with exhaling, letting go of things in our daily life. Because like you said at the beginning of this conversation, so many people don't like letting go of things. I have clients that really struggle with letting go of things. And if we can practice more of that in our day to day, even just beginning with our breath, then would that open us up to being able to let go of much bigger things? And then the ultimate thing of letting go of life, because that's the biggest letting go. Like death is almost the biggest act of surrender, right? Because we don't know where we're going. We don't know what's happening. It's the closing of a chapter and an opening of a new one, which, it is the ultimate act of surrender. And I think getting ourselves to a place where in the end, we feel totally ready to let go. My meditation teacher in his autobiography wrote about the death of his father, and his father was on his deathbed and then just said the words, I love, I love, I love. Those were his last words. And God, I found that so moving. Like I had to take a big pause and have a big cry. So I was like, if you can actually get yourself to that point before the ultimate act of surrender, where all you are being is just love and then letting go. I mean, that's life's work, right? Like getting ourselves to that point where we've cleansed ourselves, let go of everything, and then just have the final letting go. Like, wow, like what a magical experience that would be.
One of my dear friends was a monk, and he died from cancer last summer. And he always spoke about, I remember going and he was at the Bhaktivedanta Manor, which is just north of London. And it's where the Beatles were practicing, where they were Hare Krishnas. And I remember being in the garden with him, and he said, the thoughts that we have at the end of life really matter. And the way that we are at the end of that time really matter. And so many people, again, in Buddhism, your whole life is a preparation for death, for that final surrender. And he went out with a big smile on his face, apparently, right until the end. He was kind of just smiling his way through that kind of transition time. And as you say, it's those little let goes, those little opportunities that we have to practice letting go. And I think our attachments really come into it. We want to hold on to everything, don't we? Even the end of a friendship or the end of that particular transition that's really, for example, a woman moving into menopause. These kind of, so many endings that we do go through in life. And even, so there's a reason why the French call an orgasm a little death. I won't do my French accent, but they call it a little death because it's that kind of like that surrender moment. It's this little kind of death that happens. And I think that's a beautiful description as well of, yeah, there's many times that we need to die to let go, to really fully live as well while we are here.
Yeah, it reminds me of something a friend said to me last year. I think it was when I was going through a breakup, and I was just allowing myself to be with the experience and to just kind of feel the pain, feel the humanness of it, not try and reject it, not try and resist it, because then it made it worse, of course, and just try and be with it. And a friend of mine messaged me and said, how can you make this sacred? And I was like, wow, if we looked at every single ending, every single opening as a sacred experience, and this goes back to what you were saying about how we've lost this kind of sense of ceremony, this sense of devotion, this sense of rite of passage. If we start to see all these kind of different chapters in our lives and the beginning of something and the end of something as ceremonial, as something that needs reverence, that needs devotion, then yeah, how can we make it sacred? It's like, how can we honor something and be with it?
How did you do that? How did you make it sacred?
I think it was just allowing myself to be totally with the experience and honoring it, and honoring, what I had received, what I had given, what I'd experienced, what I'd gained, and seen it as this kind of like just wonderful chapter of life, instead of something that should be kind of rejected or not liking any of the discomfort that I was experiencing, and seeing the grieving process as sacred in itself. I think when we are with uncomfortable things or challenging situations or painful emotions, we do just want to stuff it down. We want it to go away. We want it to be finished. We want to distract ourselves. We want to numb ourselves. But when we can just be with the experience and just understand that it's part of the rich tapestry of the human experience, and understand that our emotions are a beautiful part of being alive and being human and feeling our sensory experience of being alive. When we can be with that fully and enter into the experience, I think that that's grace, right? And when we can experience grace, I think that's sacred.
Beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. Actually, it's interesting because the training that I was doing is called Going with Grace. And it's this thing of bringing grace into the dying process. Yeah. So that's beautiful, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I just wanted to talk a little bit about end of life care. And, you brought in psychedelics because obviously there's this kind of new but slightly taboo within the mainframe of society, frame of research, that actually psychedelics can create a lot more ease for some people during end of life experience. And there are films on Netflix, like Fantastic Fungi and things like that, which you can watch, and talking about how people can enter into this experience of oneness and not be afraid of death, that literally having an experience with psychedelics allows people to remove their fear of death. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. And yeah, it is, again, with psychedelics, things that take us to an expanded state of consciousness or a non-ordinary way of thinking. There's, again, so much fear around it because of all of the, I'm not going to call it lies, but all of the misinformation that has been out there. And it also makes me think of the fear around death. Again, it's like such a taboo, but we haven't had the important conversations. And so psychedelics, one of my favorite books for anyone who's curious about this is Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind. There are a number of ways that we can kind of reprogram our subconscious mind, but one of the most powerful ways of doing this is working, potentially, if it works for you, is with psychedelics. And crucially, having the integration around that as well. And in the 1960s, 1970s, there was so much research happening, particularly in America, around the use of psychedelics for end of life. And there's been studies done in hospitals in America where cancer patients have been given psychedelics, and in almost 80% of the kind of trials, it's really transformed their relationship to death. And some of the ways that it's done that, so it's reduced the depression and anxiety at end of life. It has made people realize that they're more than their bodies. So for those who may just believe that I'm this physical body, and they may have had that existential crisis at the end, it's helped to work through that. It's helped them to realize this kind of interconnectedness. I would say as well, this research has been done with psilocybin and LSD. That's the research elements. There's so much around mushrooms, as you said. There's the Fantastic Fungi documentary where there's the conversation about, did human consciousness evolve because of the use of psychedelics? And I think it was the oldest frozen man was found with 2 mushrooms in his pockets. So psilocybin is not a new thing. The discussions and the evolution of that psychedelic space is really evolving and booming at the moment. And it does make me think, are we kind of going down the route that we did with cannabis, for example, and THC and CBD, and just a few concerns about that. But culturally in Mexico, and people like Maria Sabina, which is really what a lot of Fantastic Fungi was inspired by, they have been using mushrooms in ritual for so long. And for me personally, it's been the most transformative thing was the role of mushrooms and psychedelics. And mainly because what's come to me, the realization, the deepest sense of peace that I've ever experienced, the greatest sense of bliss. Again, crucially, it's important to work with someone on this and integration if you're kind of potentially, well, for all of us, but kind of integrating our experiences is one thing, having the mushroom, but it's then what do I do with that information and what I see or feel or sense during a journey. But there can be a lot to be said for helping us to let go. So when we take a mushroom, for example, it's also a surrender. We have to surrender to the experience. And that's a really powerful thing. As a woman, and I was talking to a couple of friends, one who's also a death doula, and another friend who's working with psilocybin for end of life. A lot of research happening in Imperial College in London as well with Professor Nutt Robin Carhart-Harris, and we were talking about maybe creating a psychedelic hospice where we're kind of supporting the dying person and their loved ones to really let go, and psychedelics can be really powerful for that. These amazing tools that we have available to us. For me, again, kind of culturally, I like to work with mushrooms because they do grow on this land, and yeah, there's so much out there. So if anyone's curious how to change your mind, Michael Pollan, but also looking at the research trials around psilocybin for cancer patients. And people often say when psychedelics are most effective is kind of there's this thing about maybe they're slightly wasted on the youth because we might have taken them at festivals or at parties. And actually when you're in your 50s and your 60s and you've kind of maybe started to get a little bit into the mundane part of life and a little bit routined and kind of not narrow in your thinking, but you're very, let's call it, set in your ways, a psychedelic experience or an experience that is mystical can really be really transformative at that time, because it kind of breaks the pattern of being a self in a sense. So meditation can do that over maybe five years, but this is a sitting of 4 to 6 hours. I've kind of been with people and they've just said, after one journey, everything in my life makes sense. So it's a really powerful thing of what may be shown to you in a journey as well. And at end of life, when you feel like everything's hopeless, those experiences can be really healing and really transformative.
And that's the journey, isn't it? I mean, that's the journey of like self-development and spirituality, and you know, that those are the teachings. It's all this coming home to self. It's like the nature of waking up, in inverted commas, is realizing that there's no separation, there's no you and I. It's we're not our bodies, we're all connected, everything is the same ultimately. And having an experience of that whilst you're still alive changes the way that you live. You know, I've had an experience like that in meditation, and from that point on, it was like before that moment and after that moment. You know, it's like it changes the way that you live, that you move around the world. And even when you're going through these dark, challenging times, you can still be with it and believe in this broader plan.
Totally. And that element of, while we're here, let's discover maybe what brings us meaning, and that can be anything. What brings you joy? What brings you meaning? Everyone has a little thing that may connect to them. And so a psychedelic experience can also enhance that sense of meaning by realizing we're greater than this kind of maybe the me, the I. It's that ego dissolution that can come in where you feel that connection. And again, you can get that in meditation, really powerful. And as you said, it can just be that one little experience. Maybe it's for a minute where you just get that taste of possibility and expansion, and that can support you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. What would your kind of advice be to start to shift your relationship around these conversations?
Really nice thing just for you to explore, I guess, building a personal relationship with death and what that means for you. And this is going to change over our lifetime. So you might have the death of your parents, there's deaths that go through as you age, people you love, and kind of exploring what your beliefs are and what your relationship is with it. We can learn a lot from going out in nature and just seeing the way that life and death is kind of interwoven, for example, in the woods or in different spaces. And there's definitely elements of making preparation, so you kind of get things in order. And for me, it's that thing of then you can get on with living. So where are my important documents? Where's my kind of biographical information? Where's my passwords? All of these things. And again, kind of exploring what relationships could be different with this awareness that I might die. What brings me meaning? What brings me joy? All of these things. So we don't then get to that point of maybe you hear that something has happened to you or something health-wise, and you realize that I haven't done all the things that I wanted to do when I was alive. That moment of maybe explore what's it like to start living like you're dying.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so just circling back to breath.
And a deep breath.
And a deep breath. I know, just circling back to breath, because I know that you've got some really exciting breath projects on the go at the moment. So, and I personally have benefited from breath practice with you and, wonderful Reiki and things as well. Do you want to speak a little bit about what you have on offer if people want to connect with you?
Yeah, and I was going to say, actually, we've been doing some training on how Reiki can support people when they're dying for the physical to disconnect from the spirit. That's a really powerful practice. It's amazing, that tool. So death aside and all of that aside, it's a very different energy to this project, but launching with my breathwork partner a membership for creatives. So it's a self-care membership. We're using the breath, using meditation, different tools to support creativity, to support health, to feel energized. And that's a membership that we're launching soon. So it's going to be called Breathe. It's going to be an inspiring kind of community of how these tools as well can take us when we kind of move out of our usual brainwave into different levels of inspiration. And it'll be wonderful.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, my love. I've loved this conversation with you. It's given me a lot to think about myself continuously.
It's a joy being here with you. And it's been great to talk about these topics. And those who are curious, go and explore some of them, because there's fascinating things that I think we're going to see happening, hopefully, in the coming years.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, my love. Thank you so much.
Well, I hope that you found that an expansive conversation. In my experience, having these conversations, even when they are challenging, makes us more human. If you've been inspired by Soph's work with life, breath and death, I do encourage you to get in contact with her. I've worked with her firsthand, receiving her incredible breathwork journeys, and can strongly recommend practicing with her. I encourage you as well to reflect upon your own relationship with life and death, and see it as an invitation for a deeper dance of being here, of being alive. I'd love to hear your reflections and any comments. You can get in touch with me via my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan, or via my website, higher-love.com. As always, do feel free to share this episode with anybody who you feel will benefit from it. And if you yourself have enjoyed it, then please do take a moment to rate or follow or share the podcast. Thank you for being here, and big love.